Have you ever looked at the clothes you're wearing and really thought about how they were made? It's easy to see the fabric, the color, the style, but what about the invisible architecture holding it all together? Well, today, we're pulling back the curtain on pattern making, the unsung, totally brilliant blueprint behind every single piece of clothing you own.
Okay, so let's just dive right in. The central question, the puzzle that creators have been trying to solve for centuries, is this. How in the world do you take a flat, two-dimensional piece of cloth and turn it into a three-dimensional piece of art that actually fits a complex, curvy human body? It's a fascinating mix of geometry, art, and a little bit of engineering.
So at its most basic, pattern designing is just creating a template. But, it's so much more than that. It's this massive subject that blends the super technical rules of construction with the creative artistry you need to make basically any style imaginable. It's really where the big idea meets the practical reality.
And here you can see the problem in plain sight. A human body isn't a simple box, right? It's this collection of all these complex geometric shapes. All those curves, dips, and contours are exactly what makes building a pattern so incredibly difficult. Every single one of them has to be accounted for on that flat piece of paper.
The whole craft, really, it just rests on two main pillars. First up, you've got to have correct measurements. That's your raw data, taken straight from the body. But all those numbers are pretty much useless without the second pillar, a knowledge of technique. That's the actual skill, the method you use to translate those numbers into a pattern that works. If one of those is off, the whole thing just falls apart. So let's start our little journey back in time with the very first drafts. We're talking about the earliest methods used by tailors, way before mass-produced clothing was even a thing. Back then, every single garment was a totally unique, one-of-a-kind creation.
And what's so cool is the way people describe it. They say early pattern making was a lot like learning to play music by ear. There weren't any textbooks or complicated theories. It was all instinctive, a craft that was passed down from master to apprentice, where a tailor just developed a feel for it through years of hands-on practice.
So these early systems, they were all about practicality. Imagine a busy tailor. They didn't have time to mess around. They would draft the pattern directly onto the final expensive fabric. Speed and simplicity were absolutely everything. And to make it even faster, the seam allowances were just built right into that first draft. And because there was no room for error, skilled tailors would add these things called inlays, basically little bits of extra fabric hidden in the seams, just in case they made a mistake. A clever little insurance policy.
But, things change. Society was industrializing, the demand for clothing was exploding, and this one-by-one custom approach just couldn't keep up. So the search began for a kind of silver bullet, a universal, more scientific way to make patterns for more people and fast. And that's where proportionate systems come into the story.
The big idea behind all of this was pretty radical, really. It was, what if the human body isn't actually that unique? The theory was that the body is basically a predictable machine, that it could be divided neatly into 8 heads, and that all the main measurements, like your chest, waist, and hips, were all mathematically proportional to each other.
And you can see why this was so appealing, right? For a world that was suddenly obsessed with standardization, this was the dream. It promised a shortcut, a way to skip all those tedious individual measurements and just use one single ready-made formula that, in theory, would give a perfect fit to absolutely everyone.
It sounded amazing, absolutely perfect. But when this neat little formula met the messy reality of actual human beings, well, a huge flaw appeared, and it threw the whole system into doubt. And here's the fundamental flaw, and it's something we all kind of know deep down. No two human bodies are the same, not even close. We come in this beautiful, infinite variety of shapes and sizes and proportions, and a single, rigid, mathematical formula just could never account for all that wonderful diversity.
And here's the final nail in the coffin from an expert pattern maker, Philip Koenig. He basically said that when you try to use these hypothetical scales, they just completely fall apart at the edges. For people who are very small or very large, the patterns almost never gave a good fit. The silver bullet, well, it had completely missed its target.
So what do? You take the lessons you've learned from the tailor's gut instinct and from the scientist's flawed formula, and you combine them. And out of that, a new, much more flexible and reliable system was born, one that completely revolutionized the industry and, believe it or not, is still the foundation we use today.
And you can see just how big a leap this was. Instead of drawing on pricey fabric, patterns were now made on cheap paper. Instead of locking in the seam allowances from the start, they were added later, which gave you way more flexibility. And, this is the big one, Instead of starting from scratch every single time, the block method gave designers a standardized, reusable foundation to build from.
And that foundation has a name. It's called a block, or sometimes a sloper. Now, think of this not as a pattern for a dress or a shirt, but as a master template. It's a super basic set of pieces that fits a specific body perfectly, with all the shaping darts and things, but with zero style lines or seam allowances. From this one single block, a designer can then spin off an infinite number of different styles. It's a total game changer.
But okay, a paper pattern is flat, right? And people, well, we're not flat. So to really test things out and get that perfect fit, designers also use a 3D technique called draping. This is where they literally sculpt the fabric directly onto a dress form, so they can see in real time how it's all going to hang and fit those curves.
Which brings us to one last super important step: the muslin, or the toile if you're feeling fancy. Before you dare cut into that expensive silk, you make a test version out of cheap fabric like muslin. This is basically the dress rehearsal. It's where that 2D paper blueprint gets proven into 3D world and where a designer can check the fit, the balance, and make all those tiny little tweaks to get it just right.
So that brings us all the way to today. We now have technology that can 3D scan a person's body and spit out a perfect, custom-fit pattern in just a few minutes. It's pretty amazing, but it leaves us with this really interesting question. In an age of algorithms and automation, is that hands-on, intuitive craft of the pattern maker, a skill that's been honed over hundreds of years, is it still essential? Something to think about.